The Sunday Show on Newstalk 106 to 108.
Welcome back to The Sunday Show. Shane Coleman with you until 1 o'clock. We're also in a while going to be talking about the decline in cinema numbers in Ireland over the last few years. But before that, we want to turn to the Corrib gas field in Mayo, and reports last week that it's likely to generate almost €1 billion a year once it reaches full production. It's going to have, a 20-year lifespan. When you consider those figures, you have to ask, is there a need for the government to take a greater ownership of our oil and gas resources, or is it still too much of a risky business for the state to get involved in? To discuss this, I'm joined by Pat Rabbitte, former Minister for Energy, Communications and Natural Resources, and Dominic Sherlock, a co-founder of Own Our Own Oil. Dominic, I might start with you first. Do those figures strengthen your argument, do you think, about that we have maybe sold our oil and gas resources too cheaply?
Figures are difficult really to get your head around, especially when you consider that volume is really what you should be looking at, because prices fluctuate. Whatever was done with Corrib is pretty much done, and I don't know if there's an appetite to change the licences on that. You say 20 years, I think that depends on the extraction profile that they have. Some say 10 to 12, but either way, it's a considerable amount of natural resource out there. And I think, and maybe Pat might be able to comment more on this, but the real asset in Corrib is the fields that are adjacent to it. The potential out there is more than just, they've got 7 or 8 drills, I think, at the moment in the field, and there's potential for a lot more out there.
Okay.
So,
are we getting enough for a pound of flesh of that?
No, we don't believe that in Own Our Oil, no.
Okay, so what should we be asking, or what should we be doing?
Well, we've called several times for a strategic review. Look at setting up a national oil company, oil and gas. I think it's easier just to say national oil company, but we mean all hydrocarbons. Get into a change of our licence model. I know when he was Minister, Pat did go some way to changing the licence, which was great. We're now getting 5% royalty of future licences. It wasn't retroactive, so nothing that's currently in play will come under those terms. But I think it's just indicative of the fact that the licence terms that are in place aren't good enough for Ireland, and whether or not there's an appetite to retroactively change that.
Are you saying we should have our version of Statoil, which is, of course, the Norwegian state company, or are you saying we should just levy higher taxes on those private companies that are drilling off our coast?
Well, for those that are currently drilling, levying higher taxes won't make any difference, because they can write off so much and they've accumulated so much cost, because it's a long game. So if we do want to get into getting real benefit out of our resources, it would require setting up an entity so that we could take ownership of it. At the moment, the licences confer ownership on the people who hold the licences, and many other regimes are production sharing contracts, and in order to do that, as a government, we'd need to set up an oil company or something. I'm reluctant to say Statoil, because people keep saying, look, we're not Norway, and we're not. But the Ernst & Young tax guide, you look around the world, it compares so many different countries, and we just need to find what's right for us. In 1965, when Statoil, or when Norway got into this, they were a very different animal to what they are today. They're more like what we are.
Okay, Pat Rabbitte, I imagine as a young student radical in the 60s in UCG, you would have been calling for us to set up our version of Statoil. But having spent a couple of years in the department that you did spend that time in, is it something you obviously weren't persuaded by that?
It's not so much the 3.5 years I spent in the department. It is what has happened since those high hopes of the early 70s, when indeed I did hold the views you have ascribed to me. The exploration programme in Ireland started in the 60s, and the sad news is that our high expectations have never been realised. Contrary to some of the correspondence that I regularly, well, I wouldn't exaggerate the number of them, but
we get a lot of text to the programme saying exactly that we should be doing. We've given away this huge.
Yeah, no, I regularly got texts condemning me for having given away our oil and accusing me of robbery and various things. But the problem was I'd never found any oil. That's the difficulty. There have been, since the early 70s, 4 fines, 4 commercial gas fines, and that includes Corrib. And Corrib will come on stream this year. March, April, early May, April, I would say, it will come into production. I don't disagree with what Dominic has described. It is a small field. And he's right about the duration.
Big enough revenues, though. I mean, I have to say, those figures that the Sunday Times carried last week, it did make me sit up and take notice.
I'm not sure that that's correct. And I mean,
this was signalled by one of the shareholders to its shareholders.
Yeah, well, they may be doing it. The puffing that goes on in this industry is typical. I mean, Dominic's point about rate of extraction and so on. I mean, Corrib is big enough to meet about 55% of our gas needs at peak, but the peak is about 7 or 8 years, and as he says, it depends on the rate of extraction and so on. So I'm not at all sure about the billion revenues, to be honest. But anyway, Dominic is right about one other thing, which is that there is no retroaction. And at the time of all the controversy in the Dáil, and at the time that I committed to a new review, nobody in the Dáil, and there were some pretty far out reaches of opinion expressed, none of them sought retrospection, because you can't, as a state, enter into a deal and say, then if it goes right,
Welch on it, basically.
We'll turn it around.
Yeah.
I mean, you would have all kinds of forces in Irish society opposing that, and the most far-out left people in the Dáil made that recommendation in the report of the Oireachtas Committee. To me, the changes that I brought in...
Yeah, you bumped up the tax rate pretty substantially.
Yeah, it is pretty substantial because
is it challenge... 55% now is the tax rate?
Yes.
And a royalty rate as well?
No, the royalty would be included in that. The 5% annually of the revenues based on a field. So you couldn't be drilling in other parts of the offshore and getting credit, writing that down against the field. It's on the field's revenues, and so on. But can I just make this point? The problem is, you say what views did I have in the early 70s? Whatever views I had in the early 70s, the state would not now be able to afford the establishment of a Statoil or a national exploration company. And if it were able to afford it, I think there would be an outcry if you decided to establish a vehicle at our strike rate at about 100 million euros a pop to drill a well. And at our rate of empty wells, we simply we couldn't afford it.
Yeah.
So therefore, you have to pitch the tax regime at a level that is likely to attract in, or that is likely not to frighten off the guys who will spend the
It's
money.
a happy medium, basically. It's a balancing act. I mean, Dominic, isn't Pat Rabbitte right? I mean, 10 years after Kinsale, 73 exploration and appraisal wells drilled, not one commercial discovery in the 10 years. If we had a state company doing that, not only would they be bankrupt, but the state would be bankrupt.
Well, a couple of points on that. They haven't been declared commercially viable necessarily by the companies who are sitting on the assets. Like, Providence is saying they can get 3,000 to 4,000 barrels per day out of Barry Rowe, and they would have been commercial at 1,800 barrels per day. So it's about break even. I mean, when we were at $115 per barrel, what was commercial is very different to where we are perhaps now, and this is why it's a long game and why.
I suppose the point is, a lot of people have got burnt looking for oil off the west coast of Ireland.
Now, we're not necessarily saying that we should set up an exploration company. We need to set up an entity that can own 50% of the oil, perhaps, that comes out of the ground, which is what Justin Keating's terms were back in the 1975. If you look at this, and these are on our website, their stats. If you go to ownouroil.ie/Corrib, and the figures that I'm showing you here are from the Department of Communications, Energy and Natural Resources' own website. And if you can see there, there were 16 wells drilled prior to Keating's terms, which is an average of 4 per year. 82 wells drilled while we were getting like 50% of the oil was going to be ours, and then royalties and tax on top of that. That's an average of 6.83 wells per year. And then Ray Burke came in meetings that we have no transparency into, and I think transparency is the major challenge that I think we need to talk about here today.
He abolished the 50% stake and he abolished the royalty. But, I mean, the question is, Pat Rabbitte, I mean, do you take issue? I mean, you obviously don't take issues with those figures.
The question, you see, is that if our tax terms are a giveaway, why is the Irish coastline not black with ships going out to drill? The remarks about Barry Rowe, I mean, from my point of view as minister or as former minister, they haven't changed. It would be fantastic news if Barry Rowe proves to be a commercial find. But the problem so far is that we don't know that. Yes, there's oil there, but is it commercially extractable? And in order to do that, you have to bring in substantial new investment to drill additional wells to establish if it is commercial. And so far...
Dominic?
Well, it would be fantastic news, and Pat's right on that, but it wouldn't be fantastic news for Ireland. It'd be great news for Providence or whoever they get to farm into it.
Well, if we're getting 55% tax rate...
We're not, though. I mean, they'll write off
We wouldn't on that.
No,
you think they can write that off because...
They can, and they have it on record. I mean, Atlantic Resources...
But they can write off legitimate expense. I mean, it does cost a lot of money to get... We can't tax them on the money they spent getting that oil out of the ground.
In any business, you tax profits, but I mean, this nature of being able to go back, as David Horgan of Petrol Resources said, to Adam and Eve and write off all associated costs. I mean, it's a long game that we need to play here. We need to take a much longer view than perhaps the tenure of a government.
Yeah, but I have to say, I'm struggling a little bit to understand where you're coming from. I mean, it's called owner oil, but you're saying we should just be a shareholder along with the private sector.
If we have production sharing contracts as opposed to licensing ownership away, and we have people on the rigs who can monitor what's happening, and we take the resource out of the ground and say, right, what we're getting out of this is a percentage of this actual product.
Okay, I mean, Pat, did you look at that possibility when you were minister?
Yeah, we did. We looked at every aspect of it, and as you know, the Oireachtas Committee looked at every aspect of it. The new arrangements, as I say, can take up to 55% in tax.
Any concerns about what Dominic was saying about the ability to write off large expenses against?
Well, as I say, the new regime will be field particular. So, I mean, I think, Shane, the honest answer is that if we had a significant oil find, you probably would find that the mood in the country would be different and that it would influence politics as well, because there is nothing ever stopping the sovereign minister for finance of the day from going into the Dáil chamber with his finance bill and legislating as he thinks appropriate. But the fact of the matter is we haven't found any oil, and in those circumstances the thrust of policy is to seduce in the big players to see whether or not the geological and seismic data that we have is going to produce a serious find. That's the issue. I mean, Dominic made reference to the issue not being the size of the Corrib field, but adjacent fields. Now, I sincerely hope that he's right. But I have to say to you, and perhaps I am naive, not a charge regularly levelled against me, but maybe I am. But I have no knowledge of adjacent fields. I have knowledge of drillings adjacent to Northwest Mayo that didn't produce anything. Now, the most modern processing plant anywhere in Europe is built down at Baildenboy. I think it's a reasonable question from the sceptical man in the street. Would such enormous investment have gone into constructing such a super facility as is down there if there wasn't a reasonable expectation that in the years ahead that we will make another find? And I hope we will. But I have to say, today, to the best of my knowledge, and I obviously have probed this one, no additional adjacent fine
You wouldn't be putting your mortgage on it, basically.
has been made, not at this stage.
Last word to you, Dominic.
Just about the adjacent fines, there was a WikiLeaks cable which was intercepted and is now public, where oil executives are saying that they reckon there could be up to 20 Corribs confluent out there, all adjoined. So the thing about, as Pat says, there's a great terminal down there. The investment wouldn't be justified if it was just what's there. And there's far more woodland cleared away for a terminal 1, 2, 3, 4.
Okay. Unfortunately, look, we've run out of time. We need to leave it there. My thanks to Pat Rabbitte, the former Minister for Energy, Communications and Natural Resources, still, of course, a TD for Dublin South West, and to Dominic Sherlock, co-founder of Own Our Oil. Thanks to both of you for coming in to us. Back in a moment.